Imagine standing in front of a firing squad, knowing you could walk away, knowing you could save yourself with a single word, but instead you step forward and volunteer to die in place of a complete stranger. This isn't fiction. This isn't a Hollywood script. This happened in Auschwitz, the most notorious death camp in human history, and the man who did it wore a priest's collar. His name was Maximilian Kolbe, and what he did on a scorching summer day in 1941 would echo through history as one of the most profound acts of selfless love ever witnessed behind barbed wire. But here's what they don't tell you in history class. This wasn't a spontaneous moment of heroism. This was the culmination of a life deliberately built for this exact moment, and the Nazi officers who witnessed it were so shaken that some of them would later testify they had never seen anything like it. By the end of this video, you'll understand why this Polish priest became known as the Angel of Auschwitz, and why his story was almost erased from history until one man refused to let the world forget. August 1941. Poland had been under Nazi occupation for nearly 2 years, and Auschwitz, originally built to house Polish political prisoners, had transformed into something far more sinister. The camp sprawled across the Polish countryside like a cancer, its chimneys beginning to pump dark smoke into the summer sky. Inside Block 14, 600 men lived in conditions designed to strip away every shred of human dignity. They slept on wooden planks stacked 3 levels high, so tightly packed that turning over meant coordinating with the prisoners beside you. The daily rations consisted of watery soup, a piece of bread that could fit in your palm, and ersatz coffee that tasted like burnt dirt. Prisoners lost an average of 6 to 8 pounds per week. Their striped uniforms hung on skeletal frames, and their shaved heads made everyone look like walking corpses. Among these 600 men was prisoner 16670, a 47-year-old Franciscan friar named Maximilian Kolbe, and prisoner 5659, a Polish army sergeant named Franciszek Gajowniczek, a man with a wife and 2 young sons waiting for him in Warsaw. The camp operated on a simple principle: absolute terror. The Nazi guards, particularly the SS officers, ruled through random violence and collective punishment. If one man broke a rule, 10 men would die. If one man attempted escape, the entire block would starve for days. The guards weren't just following orders. Many of them genuinely believed the prisoners were subhuman, unworthy of the air they breathed. Deputy Commander Karl Fritsch, the man who would play a central role in our story, was known for his cold efficiency. He didn't rage or scream like some of the other officers. He simply calculated, decided, and executed with the emotional investment of a man swatting flies. In his world, prisoners were numbers, not names, and their lives held the value of the labor they could provide before they collapsed. But prisoner 16670 was different. Despite the starvation, despite the daily beatings, despite watching men die beside him every single night, Maximilian Kolbe maintained something the Nazis couldn't strip away: his faith and his humanity. Before the war, he had been a well-known priest in Poland, a man who had founded a monastery and published Catholic newspapers that reached hundreds of thousands of readers. He had even traveled to Japan to establish a monastery there, becoming fluent in Japanese and studying their culture. When the Nazis invaded Poland, they specifically targeted intellectuals, priests, and anyone who could inspire resistance. Kolbe knew he was on their list. He could have fled. He could have hidden. Instead, he stayed at his monastery, sheltering 2,000 Jewish refugees until the Gestapo finally came for him in February 1941. Now, 6 months into his imprisonment, Kolbe had become a quiet legend among the prisoners. He shared his meager rations with weaker men. He heard confessions whispered in the darkness. He offered prayers over the dead before their bodies were carted away. The guards noticed him too, this priest who wouldn't break, who somehow maintained a dignity that made them uncomfortable. They beat him more severely than others, assigned him to the hardest labor details, but prisoner 16670 kept standing back up. His fellow inmates would later testify that he seemed to glow with an inner light, that his presence alone gave them the strength to survive one more day. They didn't know it yet, but they were watching a man prepare for the greatest sacrifice a human being can make. The camp had a rule, unspoken but universally understood. You survived by not being noticed, by blending into the grey mass of prisoners, by never giving the guards a reason to remember your face. Because being remembered in Auschwitz meant being selected, and being selected meant death. On the last day of July 1941, this rule was about to be tested in a way that would reveal the true measure of human courage, and prisoner 16670 was about to step out of the shadows and into history. What happened next would force us to confront an uncomfortable question. If faced with the same choice, what would we do? The evening roll call on July 30th, 1941, started like every other. Thousands of prisoners stood in perfect rows on the parade ground, the Appellplatz, as the sun began its descent behind the camp's watchtowers. The routine was always the same. Stand at attention for hours while guards counted and recounted, making sure every prisoner was accounted for. Your legs would tremble from exhaustion. Your empty stomach would cramp. But you didn't move. You didn't faint. Because collapsing during roll call meant a beating or worse. On this particular evening, something went wrong. When the count finished for Block 14, one prisoner was missing. Just one. The number didn't match the records. Somewhere between the morning work detail and evening assembly, a man had vanished. The reaction was immediate and terrifying. Whistles shrieked across the camp. Guards with German shepherds poured out of their barracks. Searchlights blazed to life, sweeping across the grounds like mechanical eyes hunting for prey. Deputy Commander Karl Fritsch arrived at Block 14 with deliberate steps, his face showing neither anger nor concern, just cold calculation. An escape attempt wasn't just a security breach, it was an insult to Nazi authority, a crack in their system of total control. Fritsch understood that controlling Auschwitz meant controlling through fear, and fear only worked if the consequences were immediate, brutal, and visible to everyone. He ordered the 600 men of Block 14 to remain standing at attention. No one was dismissed, no one was fed. They would stand through the night if necessary, until the missing prisoner was found, or until Fritsch decided their punishment. Hours crawled by. The summer heat gave way to the cold night air of the Polish countryside. Men swayed on their feet, their bodies pushed beyond the limits of endurance. Some collapsed and were dragged away. Others soiled themselves where they stood, too terrified to ask permission to move. The searchlights continued their endless sweeping, and the dogs kept barking in the distance, but no fugitive was found. By the time dawn broke on July 31st, it became clear that one of two things had happened. Either the prisoner had successfully escaped, which almost never occurred, or he had died somewhere in the camp and his body hadn't been properly logged. It didn't matter to Fritsch, the punishment would be the same. As the morning sun climbed higher, Fritsch finally spoke. His voice carried across the assembled prisoners with practiced authority. The announcement was simple and absolute. Because one man had attempted escape, 10 men from Block 14 would die by starvation in the underground bunker. This was standard procedure, collective punishment designed to turn the prisoners against each other, to make them police themselves out of self-preservation. Fritsch would personally select the 10 men. He began walking slowly along the rows, his boots clicking against the hard ground. Every few steps he would stop, point at a prisoner and say a single word. The chosen men would step forward, their faces draining of color as they realized they had just been sentenced to one of the most agonizing deaths imaginable, locked in a concrete cell without food or water until their bodies simply shut down, a process that typically took 2 weeks of unspeakable suffering. Fritsch made his selections with the randomness of a man choosing items from a shelf. He pointed at a prisoner here, another there, showing no pattern or logic. When he stopped in front of prisoner 5659, Franciszek Gajowniczek, a Polish army sergeant with a wife and 2 young sons, and pointed at him, something inside the man broke. Gajowniczek didn't scream or resist, but witnesses reported that he cried out in despair, a sound that came from somewhere deeper than fear, a father's anguish at the thought of his children growing up without him. He was the 9th man selected. Fritsch moved on, chose the 10th victim, and turned to march the condemned men toward the starvation bunker. The selection was complete. The punishment was set. And then prisoner 16670, Father Maximilian Kolbe, stepped out of line and began walking toward Deputy Commander Fritsch, breaking the most sacred rule of Auschwitz. Never draw attention to yourself. Every prisoner in that yard understood what stepping out of line meant. It meant immediate execution. It meant a rifle butt to the skull or a bullet through the chest before your body hit the ground. The SS guards didn't negotiate, didn't ask questions, didn't tolerate anything that resembled defiance. Yet here was this skeletal priest, prisoner 16670, walking calmly toward one of the most feared men in Auschwitz, as if he were approaching an altar. The other prisoners held their breath. Some closed their eyes, unable to watch what they assumed would be a summary execution. The guards raised their weapons, fingers on triggers, waiting for Fritzsch's command. But Fritzsch didn't give the order to shoot. Perhaps it was curiosity. Perhaps it was shock that anyone would be foolish enough to approach him. He simply stood there, watching this emaciated man in striped prison uniform stop 3 feet away and remove his cap in a gesture of respect that seemed absurd given the circumstances. What happened next defied everything Auschwitz represented. Kolbe spoke. His voice was steady, clear, without a trace of fear or pleading. He told Fritzsch that he wanted to make an exchange. He wished to take the place of one of the condemned men. Specifically, he wanted to die instead of prisoner 5659, the man who had cried out for his family. The audacity of the request should have been met with instant violence. Prisoners didn't make requests. Prisoners didn't negotiate for other prisoners' lives. They survived by keeping their heads down and their mouths shut. Yet Fritzsch didn't strike him. Instead, the deputy commander asked a question that revealed something almost human beneath his SS uniform. He asked Kolbe why. Why would anyone volunteer for a death sentence? Why would a man choose to starve in a concrete bunker when he could potentially survive another day, another week, maybe even until liberation? Kolbe's answer was simple and devastating in its clarity. He told Fritzsch that he was a Catholic priest, that he had no wife, no children, no one waiting for him. The other man, WWII, was a father. His life had more value because it extended beyond himself into a family that needed him. Kolbe presented this logic not as a moral argument, but as a practical calculation, speaking to Fritzsch in terms a Nazi administrator might understand: utility, value, function. But underneath those words was something else entirely, something the other prisoners recognized even if Fritzsch didn't. This wasn't despair. This wasn't a man who had given up and chosen a quick death over slow starvation. This was deliberate sacrifice, the kind of love that philosophers and theologians write about, but rarely anyone actually demonstrates when the moment demands it. The silence that followed stretched for what felt like an eternity. Fritzsch studied Kolbe's face, perhaps looking for signs of insanity or hidden motivation. The other guards stood frozen, uncertain how to process what they were witnessing. In the entire history of Auschwitz, in all the death camps across occupied Europe, no one had ever volunteered to take another prisoner's place. It simply didn't happen. The entire Nazi system was designed to crush human solidarity, to reduce people to animals fighting over scraps. Yet here was living proof that even in hell, something in the human spirit refused to be extinguished. Fritzsch could have said no. He could have shot Kolbe where he stood and proceeded with his original selection, but for reasons that even he probably couldn't fully articulate, reasons that some of the guards would struggle with for the rest of their lives, Fritzsch nodded. The exchange was approved with bureaucratic efficiency. Fritzsch ordered WWII to step back into the ranks of the living. He pointed at Kolbe and added him to the group of condemned men. The paperwork would be adjusted later. Prisoner 5659 was replaced by prisoner 16670. Just like that, with a few words and a nod, one man's death sentence became another man's chosen fate. WWII stumbled back into formation, his mind unable to process what had just happened. The other 9 condemned men stared at Kolbe with a mixture of awe and incomprehension, and Father Maximilian Kolbe, the priest who had just volunteered for one of the most horrific deaths imaginable, calmly replaced his cap and joined the line of men being marched toward the starvation bunker in the basement of Block 11, the block the prisoners called the Death Block. Block 11 stood apart from the other barracks, a place of concentrated horror even by Auschwitz standards. This was where the Gestapo conducted interrogations, where prisoners were tortured for information or simply for sport, where experimental punishments were tested before being implemented camp-wide. The basement of Block 11 contained the starvation cells, windowless concrete boxes barely large enough for a man to stand upright. No light penetrated these chambers, except when the guards opened the metal door to check if anyone had died yet. No sound escaped, except the occasional moan or prayer that echoed through the corridors. Men sent to these cells were meant to simply fade away, their deaths slow enough to serve as a warning, but certain enough to maintain the statistics. The average survival time was 2 weeks, though some lasted only days if they were already weakened from camp life. The 10 condemned men were stripped naked and shoved into cell 18, a space designed for perhaps 4 people, now holding 10 skeletal bodies. The metal door slammed shut with a finality that seemed to seal them away from the world of the living. In total darkness, pressed against cold concrete and each other's bodies, the men began the psychological descent that always preceded the physical one. Most prisoners in the starvation cells went mad before they died. They would claw at the walls until their fingernails ripped off. They would drink their own urine and fight each other for drops of condensation on the concrete. They would scream until their voices gave out, then continue screaming silently until their minds broke completely. The guards expected this. They had seen it dozens of times. What they didn't expect was what began happening in cell 18. Instead of screams, they heard singing. Instead of the sounds of men descending into animal desperation, they heard prayers. Father Kolbe had transformed the death cell into a chapel. The guards, who periodically opened the door to remove bodies, reported something they had never witnessed before. The prisoners were standing in a circle, and Kolbe was leading them in hymns. His voice, weakened by starvation but somehow still clear, filled that concrete tomb with songs of faith and hope. He heard confessions from the other men. He recited psalms from memory. He discussed theology and philosophy and the nature of suffering. When one man would begin to break down, consumed by thirst or hunger or despair, Kolbe would comfort him, redirect his thoughts, remind him that their suffering had meaning because they chose to face it with dignity. The effect on the guards was profound and disturbing. These were men trained to view prisoners as subhuman, trained to feel nothing as they watched people starve to death. But the sounds coming from cell 18 unsettled them in ways they couldn't articulate. Some of the guards began volunteering for other duties to avoid the death block. Others would stand outside the cell door, listening to the hymns, their faces showing confusion and something that might have been shame. One guard, a man named Bruno Borgoviec, who worked in the death block as an interpreter and assistant, later testified that he had never seen anything like it. He described how Kolbe remained lucid and compassionate even as his body began shutting down, how he used his final reserves of strength not to extend his own life but to ease the suffering of the other 9 men dying beside him. Days turned into a week, then nearly 2 weeks. One by one, the other men succumbed. Their bodies were dragged out and logged with cold efficiency. Date of death, cause of death by starvation, prisoner number, case closed. But Kolbe continued to survive, continued to pray, continued to sing, even when he was alone in that cell. By the second week of August, only 4 men remained alive in cell 18, their bodies so wasted that they barely resembled human forms. The guards reported that Kolbe, despite being 47 years old and having endured months of camp brutality before entering the starvation cell, somehow remained conscious and aware. His eyes were still clear. His voice, though weakened to a whisper, still formed words of prayer. He was dying, certainly, but he was dying on his own terms, and that reality was beginning to disturb even the most hardened SS officers in the camp. By August 14, 1941, 2 weeks after the men had been locked in cell 18, the Nazi administration faced an unusual problem. The starvation cells were needed for new victims, new punishments, new demonstrations of absolute control. But 4 prisoners, including Kolbe, were still alive, their bodies clinging to existence with a tenacity that bordered on the supernatural. Under normal circumstances, the guards would simply wait. Starvation was patient. It always won eventually. But the death block had a schedule to maintain, and more importantly, Kolbe's continued survival was becoming a problem that extended beyond logistics. Word had spread through the camp about the singing priest, the man who volunteered to die and then refused to die quietly. Prisoners whispered about him during work details. Even some guards spoke about him in hushed tones when their superiors weren't listening. He was becoming a symbol, and symbols were dangerous in a place designed to crush hope. The decision was made at an administrative level, probably by Fritsch himself, though the exact chain of command was never fully documented. The 4 remaining prisoners in cell 18 would be given injections of carbolic acid directly into their veins, a method that caused death within seconds through cardiac arrest. This wasn't mercy. This was efficiency. The camp needed those cells emptied, and waiting for nature to take its course was no longer acceptable. A man named Hans Bock, a German criminal prisoner who had been assigned to work as a medical orderly, was given the task. He wasn't a doctor or a nurse. He was simply someone the Nazis trusted to follow orders without asking questions. He gathered the syringes, filled them with the lethal chemical, and descended into the basement of Block 11 with a guard escort. When Bock opened the door to cell 18, he found a scene that would haunt him for the rest of his life. 3 men were barely conscious, their bodies curled in fetal positions on the concrete floor, their breathing shallow and irregular. But Father Kolbe was sitting upright against the wall, his back straight despite his emaciated condition, his eyes open and alert. Bock later testified that Kolbe looked at him without fear, without anger, without any of the desperation he had seen in countless other dying prisoners. Instead, the priest extended his arm willingly, offering his vein for the injection, as if he were simply cooperating with a routine medical procedure. There was no struggle, no pleading, no final breakdown. Kolbe prayed quietly as Bock prepared the syringe, his lips moving in what appeared to be a blessing or perhaps a final prayer for those who were about to kill him. The injection took only seconds to administer. The carbolic acid entered Kolbe's bloodstream and traveled to his heart with chemical precision. His body convulsed once, a brief violent reaction as his cardiac system failed. Then he slumped forward, and it was over. Prisoner 16670, Father Maximilian Kolbe, the priest who had volunteered to die in place of a stranger, was officially dead at approximately 3 o'clock in the afternoon on August 14th, 1941. Bock administered the same injection to the 3 remaining prisoners, their deaths coming with equal swiftness. The bodies were removed, the cell was washed down with disinfectant, and the death block was ready for its next occupants. From a Nazi administrative perspective, the incident was closed, the paperwork was filed, the camp continued operating with its usual brutal efficiency. But something had changed in Auschwitz, something subtle but undeniable. The prisoners who had witnessed Kolbe's sacrifice, who had heard the stories from Block 14, who had listened to the guards' whispered conversations about the singing priest, carried something new inside them. Proof that even in the darkest place humanity had ever created, even under conditions designed to reduce people to animals, the human spirit could still choose love over survival, sacrifice over self-preservation, meaning over meaning. Lessness. The Nazis could control their bodies, could starve them, beat them, work them to death, but Kolbe had demonstrated that they couldn't control what happened in the space between stimulus and response, that final refuge of human freedom. And that demonstration, that living proof of transcendent love, was something no amount of carbolic acid could kill. Kolbe's body was carried to the crematorium on a wooden cart, along with dozens of other corpses from that day's death toll. In Auschwitz, the dead had no names, only numbers logged in ledgers before their bodies were reduced to ash and smoke. The Nazi system was designed to erase not just lives, but the very memory of those lives, to make it as if these people had never existed at all. Kolbe should have disappeared into that machinery of oblivion, just another statistic among the more than 1 million people who would eventually die in that camp. His ashes mixed with countless others, scattered or dumped into nearby rivers, leaving no grave, no marker, no physical evidence that prisoner 16670 had ever walked the earth. The Nazis had perfected the art of making people vanish. They had documentation systems, disposal procedures, entire bureaucracies dedicated to erasing human beings. But they had miscalculated one critical factor. They had allowed witnesses to survive. Franciszek Gajowniczek, the man whose life Kolbe had saved, was still alive. He had watched the priest march toward the death block. He had stood in formation, knowing that someone had chosen death so he could live. And unlike so many others in Auschwitz, Gajowniczek would survive the war. He endured 4 more years of camp life, watching countless men die around him, but he survived. When the Soviet army liberated Auschwitz in January 1945, Gajowniczek walked out of those gates carrying with him a story that demanded to be told. He returned to Poland to discover that his wife had survived, but his 2 sons had been killed during the Warsaw Uprising. The family he had been saved for was gone. That loss would have destroyed most men, filled them with crushing guilt, or turned Kolbe's sacrifice into a cruel cosmic joke. But Gajowniczek chose differently. For the next 50 years, until his death in 1995 at the age of 93, Franciszek Gajowniczek dedicated his life to ensuring the world remembered Father Maximilian Kolbe. He traveled throughout Poland and eventually around the world, speaking at churches, schools, and memorials. He testified at tribunals. He met with journalists and historians. He recounted the moment Kolbe stepped out of line again and again, never embellishing, never dramatizing, simply stating the facts with the precision of a man who knew his only purpose was to bear witness. When people would thank him for keeping Kolbe's memory alive, he would correct them. He wasn't keeping the memory alive. He was repaying a debt that could never truly be repaid. His very existence was evidence of what had happened in that parade ground on July 31st, 1941. But Gajowniczek wasn't the only witness. Other prisoners who had been in Block 14 that day also survived. They corroborated every detail. Kolbe stepping forward, the exchange with Fritsch, the sound of hymns coming from the starvation cell. Even some of the guards, men like Bruno Bogowiec, who had worked in the death block, eventually came forward with their testimonies, describing what they had seen and heard. These accounts began circulating in Poland immediately after the war, even as the country fell under Soviet control and the communist government tried to suppress religious narratives. The Catholic Church in Poland, despite intense persecution, quietly collected these testimonies, interviewing survivors, documenting dates and details, building a case not for a legal trial, but for something far more significant: canonization. The Church's investigation into Kolbe's life and death took decades. They examined his writings from before the war, his work founding monasteries and publishing religious materials, his known opposition to Nazi ideology. They interviewed hundreds of people who had known him. They verified the facts of his death through multiple independent sources. And they discovered something remarkable. Kolbe's sacrifice wasn't an isolated moment of heroism. It was the culmination of an entire life philosophy he had written about and preached for years. Before the war, he had published essays about the nature of love, arguing that true love always involves sacrifice, that the greatest expression of human dignity is choosing to lay down your life for another. In Auschwitz, he had simply lived out the ideas he had spent decades contemplating. His death wasn't random or impulsive. It was the logical conclusion of a deliberately constructed moral framework, and that made it even more powerful. The global recognition of Kolbe's sacrifice began slowly, hindered by the Iron Curtain and Cold War politics. Poland remained under Soviet control, and the communist government viewed the Catholic Church as a threat to their authority. Religious figures, especially those who could be elevated to martyr status, were dangerous because they represented an alternative source of moral authority, something that couldn't be controlled through propaganda or force. The Polish Church worked quietly, carefully preserving documents and testimonies, waiting for an opportunity that seemed like it might never come. But in 1978, something extraordinary happened that would change everything. A Polish cardinal named Karol Wojtyła was elected pope, taking the name John Paul II. For the first time in over 400 years, the Catholic Church had a non-Italian pope, and more importantly, they had a pope who understood totalitarianism intimately, who had lived under Nazi occupation and then communist rule, who knew exactly what Kolbe's sacrifice meant in the context of systemic evil. Pope John Paul II made Kolbe's canonization a personal priority. He understood that Kolbe's story wasn't just about one man's heroism. It was about proving that human dignity could survive even in conditions specifically designed to destroy it. The Pope fast-tracked the canonization process, which typically takes centuries, pushing it through in less than 3 years. The formal investigation confirmed what the witnesses had always maintained. Kolbe had voluntarily taken Gajowniczek's place. He had died as a result of that choice, and his actions met the Church's definition of martyrdom, specifically martyrdom of charity, dying out of love for another person. On October 10, 1982, in St. Peter's Square in Vatican City, Pope John Paul II canonized Maximilian Kolbe as a saint, officially recognizing him as Saint Maximilian Kolbe, patron saint of prisoners, drug addicts, political prisoners, families, journalists, and the pro-life movement. The canonization ceremony was attended by over 150,000 people, including survivors of Auschwitz, Catholic clergy from around the world, and dignitaries from dozens of nations. But the most powerful moment came when Pope John Paul II paused his formal address and pointed to an elderly man sitting in the front row. It was Franciszek Gajowniczek, now 81 years old, the living embodiment of Kolbe's sacrifice. The Pope asked Gajowniczek to stand, and as he rose on unsteady legs, the entire crowd erupted in applause that lasted for several minutes. Cameras captured Gajowniczek weeping, his face showing the weight of 41 years spent carrying the story of a man who had chosen to die so he could live. The Pope embraced him, and in that moment the entire world witnessed the living proof that love could triumph over the machinery of death, that one act of selfless sacrifice could echo across decades and inspire millions. The canonization transformed Kolbe from a Polish Catholic figure into a global symbol. His story appeared in textbooks, documentaries, and films. Cell 18 in Block 11 at Auschwitz became a pilgrimage site, with flowers and candles perpetually placed outside the metal door. Thousands of visitors each year would stand in that basement, trying to imagine the hymns echoing through the darkness, trying to comprehend the kind of faith that could transform a death cell into a sanctuary. Religious and secular leaders alike invoked Kolbe's example when discussing moral courage, the nature of sacrifice, and humanity's capacity for good, even in the presence of overwhelming evil. He became one of the most recognized saints of the 20th century, his image appearing in churches across every continent. But perhaps the most profound impact of Kolbe's canonization wasn't measured in numbers of pilgrims or mentions in media. It was the questions his story forced people to confront. When Americans learned about the priest who volunteered to die in Auschwitz, they had to ask themselves, would I do that? Could I do that? What would it take for me to value someone else's life more than my own survival? These weren't abstract theological questions. These were deeply personal challenges to examine the foundation of one's own moral framework. Kolbe's story didn't offer easy answers or comfortable platitudes. It offered something far more unsettling, a real example of what perfect love looks like when pushed to its absolute limit, and the implicit challenge to measure our own lives against that standard. The deeper you examine Kolbe's sacrifice, the more complex and challenging it becomes. This wasn't a soldier diving on a grenade to save his squad, acting on training and adrenaline in a split-second decision. This wasn't a parent instinctively shielding a child from danger. Kolbe had time to think. He watched Fritzsch select the condemned men one by one. He heard Gajowniczek's cry of despair. And then he made a calculated decision to volunteer for one of the most agonizing deaths imaginable, knowing exactly what awaited him in that starvation cell. He chose 2 weeks of conscious suffering over the possibility, however slim, of surviving another day. Psychologists and ethicists have studied this moment for decades, trying to understand the cognitive process that allows a human being to override the most fundamental biological imperative, self-preservation. What they've concluded is both humbling and disturbing. Most people, even those who consider themselves moral and good, would not and could not make the choice Kolbe made. Studies conducted after World War II, including Stanley Milgram's obedience experiments and Philip Zimbardo's Stanford prison experiment, revealed uncomfortable truths about human nature under pressure. The vast majority of people, when placed in situations of authority or extreme stress, will follow orders, rationalize cruelty, or prioritize their own survival over abstract moral principles. This isn't because people are inherently evil. It's because the human brain is wired for survival, and moral courage requires overriding millions of years of evolutionary programming. Kolbe did something that goes against our deepest biological coding. He chose certain death over uncertain survival. He chose a stranger's life over his own. And he did it calmly, without hesitation, in a place where every prisoner had been systematically broken down, where the daily reality was designed to eliminate exactly the kind of thinking that leads to self-sacrifice. What makes Kolbe's choice even more remarkable is the context of Auschwitz itself. This wasn't a camp where prisoners maintained solidarity and fought together against their oppressors. The Nazis had perfected a system that turned prisoners against each other. Food was scarce, so prisoners would steal from one another. Work details had quotas, so slower prisoners were beaten by their own bunkmates. The capos, prisoners given authority over other prisoners, were often more brutal than the SS guards because cruelty was their only path to survival. Auschwitz was designed to prove that civilization was a thin veneer, that under enough pressure, humans would revert to animals fighting for scraps. The camp was a laboratory, testing the hypothesis that human dignity was an illusion. And then Kolbe stepped forward and demolished that hypothesis with a single act. The guards who witnessed the exchange between Kolbe and Fritsch were confronted with cognitive dissonance that some of them never resolved. They had been taught that Slavs were subhuman, that priests were parasites, that prisoners were resources to be used and discarded. But here was a prisoner displaying moral courage that exceeded anything they had seen from their own officers and comrades. Some guards later testified that watching Kolbe volunteer shook their faith in Nazi ideology more than any propaganda or military defeat could have. A few even claimed it was the beginning of their own moral awakening, though whether this was genuine reflection or post-war self-justification remains debatable. What's undeniable is that Kolbe's action created a rupture in the narrative the Nazis told themselves about who was superior and who was subhuman. Bruno Borgoviec, the German prisoner who worked as an interpreter in the death block and who heard the hymns coming from cell 18, later wrote that the experience forced him to reconsider everything he thought he understood about strength and weakness, about winners and losers. In his testimony, he described how the guards would mock the prisoners as weak, as pathetic, as less than human. But standing outside that cell, listening to men sing as they starved to death, listening to Kolbe comfort the others even as his own body failed, Borgoviec realized that true strength wasn't physical dominance or the ability to inflict suffering. True strength was the capacity to maintain human dignity in conditions designed to strip it away. The guards had the guns, the food, the power, but they were terrified of what was happening in that cell because it revealed their own moral poverty. The immediate aftermath of Kolbe's death rippled through Auschwitz in ways the Nazi administration couldn't fully suppress. Prisoners who had witnessed the exchange whispered the story during work details, passing it from block to block with the careful secrecy of men who understood that hope itself was a form of resistance. In a place where the guards worked tirelessly to convince prisoners that they were alone, that solidarity was impossible, that every man existed only for himself, Kolbe's sacrifice became a dangerous counter-narrative. It proved that even here, even in the most efficient killing machine ever devised, the human capacity for love could not be completely extinguished. Some prisoners later testified that knowing what Kolbe had done gave them the strength to survive one more day, then another, then another. His death became a form of spiritual resistance, a weapon against despair that the Nazis couldn't confiscate or destroy. Franciszek Gajowniczek faced a different kind of struggle. He returned to his barracks after the selection, saved but psychologically shattered. Survivor's guilt is now a recognized psychological condition, but in 1941, Gajowniczek had no framework to understand what he was experiencing. He had watched a stranger volunteer to die so he could live, and now he had to wake up every morning, knowing that his continued existence cost someone else everything. Other prisoners in Block 14 treated him with a mixture of awe and discomfort. Some saw him as blessed, chosen by fate or divine intervention. Others couldn't look at him without thinking about the priest who was at that moment starving to death in cell 18. Gajowniczek later described those 2 weeks as a kind of purgatory, where he was alive but couldn't fully inhabit his own life, existing in a state of suspended grief and gratitude, that felt impossible to reconcile. When news of Kolbe's death finally reached the block, delivered with cold efficiency by a guard reading from a list of deceased prisoners, Gajowniczek experienced what he later called a spiritual crisis that lasted years. He had survived the war, but part of him had died in that starvation cell alongside the priest. The guilt was compounded when he returned home to discover his sons had been killed. The family he had been saved for no longer existed in the form he had imagined during those years of imprisonment. Many survivors in similar situations chose suicide, unable to bear the weight of living when so many had died. But Gajowniczek made a different choice. He decided that the only way to honor Kolbe's sacrifice was to ensure it meant something, to transform his survival into testimony, to become a living memorial that would prevent the story from being buried in the ashes of Auschwitz. The transformation of Gajowniczek from a saved man into a witness took time. He spent years processing what had happened, consulting with priests and psychologists, trying to understand the theological and moral dimensions of what Kolbe had done. He came to see his own survival not as a random gift, but as a responsibility, a mission that gave his post-war life meaning and purpose. When he finally began speaking publicly about Kolbe in the early 1950s, despite the communist government's attempts to suppress religious narratives, he did so with the precision of a man who understood that he was the primary source, the living proof, the one person who could definitively say, yes, this happened, I was there, this man died, so I could tell you this story. The theological implications of Kolbe's sacrifice continue to generate debate among scholars and clergy. Some argue that his act represents the highest form of Christian love, literally following Christ's teaching that greater love has no man than to lay down his life for his friends. Others point out that Gajowniczek wasn't even Kolbe's friend. They were strangers thrown together by circumstance, which makes the sacrifice even more profound because it wasn't rooted in personal relationship, but in the recognition of universal human dignity. The Catholic Church resolved this debate by creating a new category of martyrdom specifically for Kolbe: martyr of charity, someone who died not because of religious persecution directly, but because of an act of selfless love rooted in religious conviction. This designation was unprecedented and has only been applied to a handful of individuals in the 2,000-year history of the Church. Today, more than 80 years after Kolbe's death, his story continues to resonate in ways that transcend religious boundaries and cultural contexts. In the United States, where individualism and self-preservation are often celebrated as virtues, Kolbe's sacrifice presents a radical challenge to conventional thinking about success, happiness, and the good life. American culture often measures worth through achievement, wealth, and personal fulfillment. But Kolbe achieved nothing by those metrics. He died in obscurity, his body burned and scattered, his name almost lost to history. Yet his single act of sacrifice has inspired millions and fundamentally altered how we think about human potential under extreme duress. His legacy forces uncomfortable questions into modern American discourse. What are we willing to die for? More importantly, what are we willing to live for? If Kolbe could choose death to save a stranger, what choices are we making in our comfortable lives? And how do they measure against that standard? The story of Kolbe and Gajowniczek has become a touchstone in discussions about moral courage, appearing in military academies, business ethics, courses, and leadership seminars. Organizations like the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C., feature Kolbe's story prominently in their exhibitions, using it to illustrate that the Holocaust wasn't just about the machinery of death, but also about individual choices made in response to systemic evil. Every person in Auschwitz faced daily decisions about how to behave, how to treat others, whether to maintain their humanity or surrender to the brutality around them. Most people, understandably, chose survival. Some chose collaboration. A few, like Kolbe, chose something else entirely. His example doesn't condemn those who made different choices. It simply illuminates what's possible when someone decides that some things matter more than survival. But here's what's often left out of the sanitized versions of Kolbe's story, the part that makes it truly challenging rather than just inspiring. Kolbe didn't volunteer because he was depressed or suicidal or had given up. He volunteered because he genuinely believed that his death would have more meaning than his survival. He calculated the value of lives, his own and WWII's, and concluded that saving a father was worth more than saving a priest. This kind of moral mathematics is deeply uncomfortable for modern audiences. We want to believe that all lives have equal value, that you can't and shouldn't weigh one person's worth against another. But Kolbe did exactly that, and his reasoning was sound within his own framework. A man with a family had more people depending on him, therefore his survival mattered more. Whether you agree with that logic or not, you can't deny its internal consistency or the fact that Kolbe was willing to stake his life on it. The deliberate erasure of Kolbe's story by the Nazis, and then its near erasure by communist authorities in Poland, reveals something important about how power structures respond to narratives of sacrificial love. Both totalitarian systems understood that Kolbe's example was dangerous because it proved that individuals could maintain moral agency even when every external structure was designed to eliminate it. The Nazis wanted to demonstrate that humans were just sophisticated animals, that under enough pressure, we'd all revert to base survival instincts. Kolbe proved them wrong. The communists wanted to show that religious faith was an opiate, a fantasy that couldn't survive confrontation with material reality. Kolbe proved them wrong too. His story survived both attempts at suppression because WWII refused to let it die, because witnesses kept speaking, because the truth, as uncomfortable and challenging as it was, demanded to be told. Standing in Cell 18 today, now preserved as part of the Auschwitz-Birkenau State Museum, visitors from around the world confront the physical space where Kolbe sang hymns as he starved. The cell is tiny, claustrophobic, its concrete walls still bearing the scratches and marks of prisoners who died there. Flowers and candles cover the floor, left by pilgrims and tourists, believers and skeptics, all trying to make sense of what happened in that darkness. There's a photograph of Kolbe on the wall, taken before his arrest, showing a middle-aged man with glasses and a gentle smile, looking utterly ordinary. That ordinariness is perhaps the most unsettling part. He wasn't a superhero or a saint in the Hollywood sense. He was a regular person who made an extraordinary choice because his entire life had been preparation for that moment. The angel of Auschwitz wasn't an angel at all. He was a man who understood that the only thing the Nazis couldn't take from him was his freedom to choose how he would face death. In that choice, in that moment when he stepped out of line and walked toward Fritzsch, Maximilian Kolbe demonstrated something that every person who hears his story must reckon with: that human dignity isn't something granted by governments or protected by laws or guaranteed by circumstances. It's something we either claim for ourselves or surrender, and claiming it sometimes costs everything. Franciszek Gajowniczek lived 54 years after walking out of Auschwitz, and he spent every one of those years making sure the world remembered the priest who bought his life with 2 weeks of agony in a concrete cell. That's not just a Holocaust story. That's not just a Catholic story. That's a human story, one that asks each of us what we would do if faced with the same choice, and whether our lives lived in freedom and comfort demonstrate even a fraction of the courage shown by a Polish priest in the darkest place humanity has ever created. His story was almost erased, but it survived, and now you know why.